Hello everyone, and welcome to On Thin Ice. My name is Philip, and where most birds have their heads in the clouds, I have both flippers planted firmly on the ground, which is a very important characteristic when it comes to this week's episode. I'll be keeping it short and sweet. The title is not clickbait. We're going through every official album release of the New York-based superstar rock band, The Strokes. Which album will end up on top? How will the middle of the list shake out? Which album is the worst? And why is it Come Down Machine? We'll get to all these questions and more in this video, but before that, thank you for watching, and I do hope you enjoy. For starters, let's briefly introduce you all to The Strokes. They are a 5-man band formed in New York City, and they are one of the most famous and influential musical acts ever produced by New York. When they came onto the music scene in the early 2000s, they brought a punchy, raw, organic sound that almost single-handedly saved rock music from the stale depths of grunge. Albert Hammond Jr. plays rhythm guitar, very excellently, may I add. Nick Valenci impressively handles most of the solo guitar work. Bassist Nikolai Fraiture plucks out some very cool, effortless bass lines, and Fabrizio Moretti, or Fab for short, perfectly complements the instrumentation with his aggressive drumming style, though only if you ask him nicely. Drums, please, Fab? Anyone? The cherry on top of The Strokes is Julian Casablancas, whose iconic laid-back croon takes all the right cues from the likes of Frank Sinatra, Velvet Underground's Lou Reed, and the Psychedelic Furs' Richard Butler. He may not always be on key, but his voice is so awesome that it doesn't need to be. Most of the time. We'll get to that stuff in a second. The Strokes have been actively making music since 2001, and they are still kicking today, though they haven't released anything since 2020. That more than 20-year period has seen the Strokes release 6 full-length studio albums and 1 3-track EP, which I'm not going to officially rank on this list, because I don't feel like it. To make up for this, I'll say that Oblivious and Thread of Joy are pretty good, and Drag Queen is pretty bad. With that out of the way, as an eminent Strokes expert, I will make the case for my list as the definitive, objective, and most accurate ranking of the Strokes discography. And where better to start than at last place? It's Come Down Machine. Okay, moving on to number 5. Wait, what do you mean I have to talk about it? I don't want to. Could I just skip it? Ugh, fine. I've been told by production that I have to talk about this album, so I guess I'll talk about this album. Come Down Machine is an album that exists. It has songwriting and instruments, and it was actually, in fact, written by The Strokes. Okay. It's their 5th studio album, having been released in 2013. At this stage in their career, it's obvious that the group was worried about being stuck making similar sounding music for the rest of their career. The album previous to this one, Angles, took many creative departures from the original sound of the band, and Come Down Machine represents the Strokes at their most experimental. There's just one problem. Experimentalism does not mix well with a lack of enthusiasm, and the album is dripping with laziness. It starts with Julian's vocal delivery. It's very strangely mixed. It sounds almost like he whispers saying the lyrics, then turned up the volume in post. Similarly, many of the instrumentals on the record lack substance or identity. Some of the worst culprits of this problem on the record include 80s Come Down Machine, Slow Animals, All the Time, 50-50, Partners in Crime, Chances, and Happy Ending. Notice how almost all these tracks happen one after the other? It makes the album an incredibly tiresome listen. There are standout tracks though. Tap Out is a fun opener, though the vocals are still weird. One Way Trigger is legitimately a very good Strokes song, despite the weird vocal stuff still going on. And Call It Fate, Call It Karma is many people's favorite song by the Strokes. When compared to the other albums though, Come Down Machine falls woefully short, and thus its spot in 6th is well deserved. Okay, now I can talk about number 5. Well, technically both 4 and 5. This was a very tough choice because the only truly bad album by the band is Come Down Machine. Everything else on this list is at least serviceable, though I guess that's how rankings are meant to work inherently. Anyways, I was stuck between 2 albums because it felt weird to call either of them the second worst Strokes album, but ultimately, and after much deliberation and back and forth, I've awarded the number 5 spot to First Impressions of Earth, and the number 4 spot to Angles. Both these albums are pretty darn good. though they're certainly not airtight, and they are objectively worse than the 3 albums I've placed above them. First Impressions of Earth was their 3rd studio album, released in 2005, and Angles was their 4th, released in 2011. First Impressions has some of the best Strokes songs ever in its track list, with classics such as You Only Live Once, Juicebox, Razorblade, and Heart in a Cage. That being said, there are some tracks in here that go unnoticed by most fans that I think are excellent sleeper tracks too, such as Electricityscape, Red Light, and Vision of Division. If the album ended there, it would likely end up near the top of the list. However, as you can see, it does not end there. The album is what I would call bloated, with many filler instant skip tracks such as 15 Minutes, Fear of Sleep, Killing Lies, and Evening Sun. This bloating is precisely what puts Angles above First Impressions at my number 4 spot. Angles arguably reaches the same highs as First Impressions, with Under Cover of Darkness probably being one of the top 3 best Strokes songs ever. Some other highlights include Metabolism, Taken for a Fool, Machu Picchu, You're So Right, Call Me Back, Gratisfaction, and Life is Simple in the Moonlight. There are misses on this album, of course, and for me, those are Games and Two Kinds of Happiness. But that's the thing. The album is significantly shorter than First Impressions, so there are relatively fewer skips. I'll also add that while I appreciate the experimental sounds from Angles, the style of First Impressions was a heavier, darker, edgier version of the Strokes' original sound, which I think I prefer in a lot of ways. That being said, I think First Impressions deserves to be lower than Angles due to the sheer number of meh to bad tracks it has. Before kicking off our top 3, why not consider liking and subscribing? I have loved making this show, and your support is, as always, greatly appreciated. Okay, self-promotion done. We start off our top 3 with the most recent Strokes album, The New Abnormal. Now, before I get a bunch of New Abnormal enjoyers in the comments screaming that I don't know what I'm talking about, let me explain myself. I adore this album. It's excellent, front to back. It really is. Its placement here at 3 should make 2 things clear. 1, there is a fairly large gap between this album and Angles. The New Abnormal is way better than Angles, and I don't think anyone would argue too much with that. 2, it's not so much a question of how bad The New Abnormal is, and more of an indicator of how amazing I think the other 2 albums are. Anyways, where the experimentalism of Angles and Come Down Machine fell short, the risks taken by the Strokes on The New Abnormal are calculated and extremely well executed. The worst track on the album is probably Eternal Summer, and even then, it's not that bad. It's just a bit long and a bit aimless. Everything else is tight and stripped back and simple, which is where the Strokes do some of their best work. The highlights of the album for me are The Adults Are Talking, Selfless, and Ode to the Mets, though the other tracks are certainly worth their salt too. Overall, a very good album that deserves to occupy the 3rd spot. So here we are, 2 spots left, and only 2 albums left over. I'm sure some of you Sherlock Holmes types have correctly deduced that those 2 albums are their first 2. The question remains though, which do I think is best? Allow me to answer that question somewhat indirectly right now. The second best Strokes album of all time is their 2001 debut album, Is This It? This is very nearly a perfect rock record. There's not a single song worth skipping in its entire 36-minute runtime. Last Night, Someday, Hard to Explain, The Modern Age. Need I say more? This album is chock full of classics. And let's not even get started on the influence it had. One could argue that the greatness of bands like The Killers and Arctic Monkeys is directly underpinned by the amazingness of this one album. In all likelihood, it's the single most important rock record of the 21st century. That's high praise, I know, but those of you who have listened to this album front to back will understand exactly what I'm talking about. But Philip, I can already hear you asking, why is it number 2 then? Because, believe it or not, Room on Fire is better in pretty much every single way. Released in 2003, it either matches or improves upon Is This It in every aspect. The sounds, the mixing, the songwriting, the vocals, each individual instrument. Room on Fire really does have it all. Of course, many of its tracks are amazing just on their own. Reptilia very well may be the best Strokes song ever. 1251 and Meet Me in the Bathroom are certified classics, but believe me, they're even better within the context of the album. Here, let me show you. Here's the first track, Whatever Happened. And here's track number 8, Under Control. These 8 tracks, when listened to in their intended sequential order, constitute the single best run of any Strokes album, period. I'm serious, it's that good. If you've never done that, please do. I'm begging you. It's euphoric, it's ecstatic, it's the Strokes at their very, very best. And that, my friends, is the reason why, though it's very close, Room on Fire is the best Strokes album of all time. What do you think of my list? Do you agree or disagree? Is there a single soul out there that actually enjoys Come Down Machine as an album? Leave a comment down below. I look forward to reading them and to potentially discovering if this hypothetical Come Down Machine fan actually exists. Also, if you made it this far, why not subscribe? It helps the channel out a ton. Finally, if you're interested in some of my other content, here's a link to my last video. I'm Philip, this has been On Thin Ice, and again, thank you for watching.